for any child who is having difficulty at as young as possible an age, but also make that testing available for adults.
Thanks for those messages. Marion, what did it cost for you to get diagnosed?
$1 million. The first test was, I think, around $2,000, and I called my insurance to see if they would cover it, and they just that conversation was real bad. I truly wanted to throw my phone out the window. They kept being like, "You want an X-ray?" I was like, "No, autism." "Oh, an X-ray that will cost $20." Like, I don't understand where the miscommunication was. So that was $2,000, and then my second assessment, because it wasn't a medical assessment, I actually went with a specialist in the UK, just because the United States is so behind with some of this stuff. And I believe hers was like 700 pounds, so $800 or $900. Yeah, it was not cheap. I put it on my credit card.
Dr. Natalie, why is it so expensive to get assessed for autism as an adult?
I think that is the time that it takes us to go through the assessment. So one of the things is, for example, when I'm doing the assessment that I do, there's probably about a total of 15 to 20 psychometrics, which are the tests that you do. And then there's written answers, and there's a wide variety in terms of what gets handed in to me. So sometimes I've had people hand in, probably the least I'm going to get is probably 25 pages, and often 74 pages, and I do mine in 3 parts, and so that's just for one of the parts. The amount of time, I don't actually charge for all the time that it does take me, because it would just be absolutely out of people's reach. I do it because I feel it's really important to change my life. And I think one thing that people aren't aware of is that 70% of autistics are like myself, like Marion. What we really are looking at is this 30% that we knew about that have intellectual and language disability. And so there is just such a mass of us that need to get diagnosed, because we end up, if we get diagnosed as adults, we end up with about 6 co-occurring mental health conditions. So it's pretty catastrophic, and I think it's a great disservice to us in terms of the amount of pressure that then puts on the system. So I think that I wish it was more accessible because of that reason.
We're talking to Dr. Natalie Engelbrecht. She's a psychotherapist who specializes in late diagnosed autism. Also with us, Marion Shimbari. She's author of A Little Less Broken, How an Autism Diagnosis Finally Made Me Whole. We're also hearing from you. Cole emailed, I was diagnosed in my early 30s when my son was in middle school. It was liberating because I could stop trying to mask and mimic those around me and just be myself. It's always a work in progress as girls are taught to be caregivers. I think having manners, etiquette, and service hammered into my childhood made it more difficult to see my diagnosis. So to come, how the pandemic and rise of remote work has helped autistic adults. That's just ahead. This is 1A.
PSA. This is 91.5 WBEZ. Arts coverage on WBEZ is supported in part by Lyric Opera of Chicago, presenting Mozart's romantic comedy, The Marriage of Figaro, and Janine Tesori and Tazwell Thompson's family drama, Blue, this November. lyricopera.org.
The BBC World Service, the world's radio station. The BBC World Service makes programs with a uniquely global perspective.
Enlighten where do we start?
The latest world news and current affairs.
The very best in global arts and culture.
What has been happening on the financial markets today?
Social issues, political stories.
Everything was there in a way that I've never had before.
The BBC World Service.
Overnights here on 91.5 WBEZ Chicago. There's much more ahead on WBEZ.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from the George Lucas Educational Foundation, creator of Edutopia, dedicated to improving the learning experience for America's students by sharing what works in pre-K through 12 education at edutopia.org. From the George Gund Foundation, working to make Cleveland more vibrant, sustainable, and just, and setting an example for the nation. More information available at gundfoundation.org. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Back to our guests in a moment, but first we'd like your help with Thursday's show. Christian nationalism is a movement pushing the belief that the U.S. is a Christian nation. Furthermore, that the church and the state shouldn't be separated, but combined, with the government promoting Christian values. Among the American public, support for Christian nationalism is still in the minority. One study found that 3 in 10 Americans either identify as supporters of the ideology or sympathize with it. But Christian nationalism is rising as a political force in conservative politics, from the House of Representatives to lawmakers at the state level. In response, more American Christians are organizing to push back against Christian nationalism. They say it's a threat to American democracy and to Christianity. We want to hear from you. If you identify as Christian, what have you heard about Christian nationalism? What do you think Christians and non-Christians should do to respond to Christian nationalism in the U.S.? Leave us a voicemail at 855-236-1212. If you heard people in your life support Christian nationalist beliefs, how did you respond? Or what would you like to tell them? Call us at 855-236-1A1A or leave a message with our app 1A Hotspot, and we'll share some of your thoughts on Thursday. Now back to our series In Good Health. That's when we put your questions to health experts. In 2017, the CDC estimated that at least 5.5 million U.S. adults are autistic, but a growing number are being diagnosed well into their 30s, 40s, and beyond. Here's Beth Ann in Tennessee. After struggling with school as a young person, she decided to return to community college to get a degree.
After not being in school for 20 years, I had to go through some testing, and I had the most wonderful advisor. And she emailed me and asked me to come to her office and sat down, and she said, "Has anybody ever talked to you about being neurodivergent?" And I just looked at her like she was crazy, and I said, "I don't even know what that means." Sure enough, at 38, I was diagnosed with autism, a mild form. I'm now 52. I have graduated with A's and B's, and I really would like to go back for my master's because I love learning now. And now that I know what's a struggle for me, now that I know how to explain things to people, it really is a game changer. I have learned how to better deal with people, better deal with people who get frustrated with me when I don't understand something. And I know it's not necessarily my fault, that it's the way my brain works. And life has gotten so much better.
Beth Ann, thanks for that message. You can join the conversation too. If you learned you're neurodivergent as an adult, how did you come to that diagnosis and how has it changed your life view? Our email is 1a@wamu.org. We're here with Marian Shimbari, author of the new book, A Little Less Broken, How an Autism Diagnosis Finally Made Me Whole, and Dr. Natalie Engelbrecht, an autistic psychotherapist who specializes in late diagnosed autism. We're also getting questions from you. Lisa in New Hampshire emailed, "My question is, why do adults seek a diagnosis? What purpose does it serve? Couldn't we just research it, learn how to manage it,
different reasons. One of the common reasons is that they have come to an understanding themselves. Research is showing that if you go down this autism rabbit hole and you stay down it, that we are seeing those people are actually autistic. Whereas we're finding that if you're, investigating this and finding that you're not autistic, that you'll recognize that. So once you understand that you're neurodivergent, then there becomes this idea that maybe I'm not broken, and that I have these skill sets that can be utilized, but I need some accommodations in terms of maybe things just like sensory stuff can be overwhelming, or a lot of people we like to work from home, for example, and so it requires documentation. Most workplaces or schools are gonna look for that documentation, and we're seeing like 80% of folks with autism and co-occurring ADHD, which is hugely co-occurring, because if you're autistic, you've got about a 60 to 80% chance of having ADHD as well. So I have both, and that 80% of those folks are dropping out of school, or they stop working because it's just overwhelming. So, but if we give them accommodations, we can utilize these amazing skills, and it allows them to also, we're just not believed is one of the things, because just like we couldn't believe it ourselves, people around us are struggling. So having that documentation helps. It makes it easier for people around us to process it and understand it. So those would be some of the reasons, and their kids have been diagnosed, and so they, like Marianne said, then they begin wondering, hey, maybe I'm autistic as well.
Marianne, you shared some of the emotional outcomes of getting your diagnosis, but what were some of the practical outcomes?
Yeah, I do think, kind of like to answer that person's question, there absolutely are people where the research is enough, where just, I might be different. And self-diagnosis is super, super valid in the autistic community, partly because it often will cost upwards of $2,000 to get a diagnosis. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that for many autistic people, it's not necessary to have a paper diagnosis. But for many of us, after being gaslit for so long by the medical community, it's really validating to have a piece of paper. And exactly like Natalie said, if you want to work from home, for example, or if you need legal protections for any reason, you do need an actual official diagnosis. But from a practical perspective, I found the diagnosis extremely helpful at work, right? It allowed me to ask for accommodations without being dismissed by my employers. So that meant, really simple things like, because eye contact takes so much of my attention to maintain, it's really helpful for me to turn off my video on Zoom. Then as soon as the video is off and I don't have to worry about eye contact, I can do my best kind of critical thinking work. It is for the benefit of my employer that I get the accommodations that I need as an autistic person in order to do my best, most productive work. It also means working from home so that I don't have to deal with the sensory overwhelm of being in a bright, loud, busy, constant interruptions of an office, right? So there are actual practical accommodations that you can ask for when you have an official diagnosis, and it's much harder for your bosses to dismiss you.
Well, I want to connect a couple of dots here, Marianne, because you learned later in life that you have endometriosis after struggling with pelvic pain starting back in high school. And what similarities do you see between the time it took to get that diagnosis and the time it took to receive your autism diagnosis?
Yeah, it was the same thing. So, and it really is, I didn't realize until I went through the autism assessment that the ways that we dismiss women's physical pain, we are also dismissing their mental pain. It is the same thing. So yeah, like you said, when I was in high school, I had really painful ovarian cysts that ruptured and sent me to the ER. And I wasn't diagnosed with endometriosis until I was 25. So that's a decade, which I believe, don't 100% quote me on this, but I believe that's the average time it takes for women to get a diagnosis of endometriosis is between 7 and 10 years. And it's something like 70% of teens
that complain of painful periods end up getting diagnosed with endometriosis later in life. And so they're told, oh, you just haven't learned how to deal with your period. You haven't learned how to deal with the pain of being a woman, right? It's this normalization of women's pain that I think is the biggest barrier to getting an official diagnosis for anything, not just physical conditions, but developmental ones as well.
Well, according to the CDC, autism is 4 times more common in boys than girls. But Dr. Natalie, what does that assumption that this is a young boy's disorder mean for girls or women who are being assessed?
It's a common misperception, like you said, and what it means is that if you're not young, white, and male, it's incredibly challenging to get a diagnosis. We are seeing a shift in the non-white population where that group of children are outnumbering white children now in terms of getting diagnosis, which is amazing because we're so behind there. But it makes it incredibly challenging for adult autistics, especially women, to get accurate diagnosis. Like many adults seeking the assessment just feel misunderstood, rejected, and invalidated. And I think it's really important to be aware that a lot of our medical conditions, one of the things I do in diagnosis, I look at what has this person previously been diagnosed with, because, for example, endometriosis is just much higher in autism. So as a healthcare provider, if you've got a female coming in with endometriosis, you should run a quick screen, and we have more inflammation, more heart disease, things like that. So I think that what it means is not only that we're not getting believed, but we're not getting the health care. So when I went to my doctor and I said, hey, I think I'm autistic, she completely dismissed me. And then I brought in a piece of paper and she's like, oh, of course you're autistic. Like, it's very strange, and then at that point I started being able to be assessed. Like I would say, I think I've got mast cell activation syndrome, because that's very much associated with autism. So it's not only just not getting diagnosed, but it's not getting diagnosed for a lot of things. And the other thing that ends up happening is that, healthcare providers are assuming that adult autistics are just like everybody else. And so the unique challenges this population is facing are just being dismissed. So we are starting to see some improvements in diagnosis, especially for women. We are seeing the 4-to-1, like 4 guys to 1 girl, when they're children, but that's changing to 2.5 men for every woman in adulthood. And we believe it's around 1-to-1 in some of the research. So hopefully things change for the better over time.
We're talking to Dr. Natalie Engelbrecht. She's a psychotherapist who specializes in late diagnosed autism, and Marian Shimbari, author of A Little Less Broken, How an Autism Diagnosis Finally Made Me Whole. We're also hearing from you. Kelsey in Maryland says, I cannot thank you enough for doing this episode. I'm sitting in my car in tears listening. I spent my entire life not knowing why I felt the way I did. After my child was diagnosed, I discovered I too am autistic at 34. I have been dismissed in the past many times. I have now never felt so validated understanding the truth. It helps me be a better parent to my autistic child and kinder to myself. I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. Marian, you became a mother before learning you're autistic. How did the diagnosis change your relationship with your young daughter?
Yeah, this is the big one for me. This is the biggest, best thing that changed. So when my daughter was born, I was 30, so I was a parent for 4 years before I knew I was autistic. And for those of you with children, they are a sensory nightmare. They're constantly touching you. They are making noise all the time. They have completely unreasonable demands. They are just as inflexible as you are. So parenting was very, very hard for me. And I was a really angry parent. From almost immediately after my daughter was born, I screamed at her constantly. I threw dishes across the room. It was awful because the noise, it was the constant noise, and I just didn't understand how mothers could be like walking down the street with their quiet babies in the stroller, or their screaming babies in the stroller, and the mom could just continue having a whole conversation with her friend. I could not do that. understand how people had multiple children. Like, I knew I could not do it again, could barely do it the first time. After my diagnosis, I understood that it was the sensory experience of motherhood. I didn't know it before. I thought I just wasn't equipped, right? I went to therapy, I went back to psychiatrists, I went on antidepressants, and they all told me, yeah, welcome to motherhood. It's really hard, right? It was that same kind of like normalization of women's pain that I was talking about, that, oh, welcome to motherhood. To be a mother means to be uncomfortable and unhappy all the time. But if that were true, how could people continue to have children? Like, if they were having as hard of a time as I was having, like, nobody would have kids. And so once I got the diagnosis and I realized that it was the constant noise and touching, I could communicate with my daughter and my husband about what I needed. So I remember the moment when it all clicked into place for me. I was in the car, I'm driving my daughter home from preschool, and she wants to listen to the Frozen 2 soundtrack, which is great music all around. And she's talking to me, Mommy, where does Elsa live? And where is the castle? And where's her mom? And talk. And we're in the car, and there's a lot of traffic, and there's cones that I've got to swerve around. And these are my triggers, right? There's a lot of sensory input, and I'm starting to do my, like, I describe it as a bull at the gate, right? I can sense myself about to lose it, which usually involves a lot of screaming, which scares my daughter. It's a terrible thing for a child to have to deal with. And then in that moment, a little voice was like, you're autistic and you're about to have a meltdown. And so I turned off the music and pulled over the car and turned around and explained autism to my daughter and what that would look like. And it means I can't talk in the car, right? So those, it allowed me to have a much more clear relationship with my daughter, and my rage immediately evaporated.
Well, Marion, your memoir is just a really beautiful and powerful story, and I hope people take the chance to read it, especially if after this conversation they have questions for themselves. And we'll share some resources on our website, the1a.org. We've been talking to Marion Shimbari. She's the author of A Little Less Broken: How an Autism Diagnosis Finally Made Me Whole, and Dr. Natalie Engelbrecht, a naturopathic doctor and psychotherapist who specializes in late diagnosed autism. Dr. Natalie, Marion, thank you for speaking with us. And we'll end on a few of your stories. Chris from North Carolina emailed, I am 51 years old, a physician in the midst of my journey discovering my adult autism. It is unlocking so many secrets of my past relationships, success, and challenges. Secrets I never even knew I had. Thank you for covering this. And Phil emails, I was diagnosed at 60. It took me 4 years to say I'm autistic. My life has opened up in ways that are very hard to describe. Just wonderful is all I can say. So much pain. Explained. Today's producer was Avery Jessa Chapnick. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing your stories with us. And we'll talk more soon. This is 1A.